look up one day and they're all gone. So, Brian, meet David. David, meet Brian. Brian, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Brian Herron. I'm the CEO of Opus IVS. Opus IVS is a company that makes diagnostic tools and offers remote services for technicians. We came about from a number of acquisitions of other companies. Before Opus IVS, I was with Drew Technologies. I think we're most known for the Cardac product. And I was with Drew Tech from 2006 to 2015 when we became Opus, basically.
So we kind of met at ETI Tool Tech. That's the first place that you and I met. And, my first kind of knowledge of you was with Kevin years ago. And, here's the thing. I guess my big question is, how did you get into the automotive space? Because you kind of came in by storm, and obviously I know Drew Tech, but what led you to get involved in the automotive space as a whole?
I've always been kind of quietly working in the background. And so even though I've been in the industry for almost 20 years, a lot of people don't know me because I'm usually not in front of people and, in big speaking events and things. I'm more just kind of grinding and focusing on what we're trying to do. So I came out of a company called SCT in the early 2000s, which hacked cars for performance and racing. And I came out of performance racing industry and really enjoyed that space. But, I could look ahead and see where car technology was going and thought, I think diagnostics is the place where it's going to happen. Car technology is always advancing, right? You can never stop that. But back in the 2000s, families had like one brand of car or two brands of car that they typically bought. And, now fast forward today, and there's just like every family has every different kind of car, whether it's a Tesla, a Porsche, a Volkswagen, or a GM. In 2006, I got into diagnostics with Drew Tech, and it was a really small company at the time.
Yeah, for sure.
3 or 4 people. And Drew Tech was working on the J2534 standard and working with OEMs. And when I joined the company, I said, hey, let's take this to repair technicians. Let's take this OEM diagnostic and reprogramming technology and let's go try to get it into professional technicians. So we worked with partners like Snap-on and Bosch who sold our tools, and then we just started to build a brand. And it took 10 years, of advertising on P10 and going on to technician communities and going to things like Kansas City Vision. And at the same time we were trying to do that, really the industry was changing around us to allow OE diagnostics through the J2534 interface. And the need for it was growing too, because cars were getting more complicated. You were having more reprogramming events. So everything just kind of came together. But you look back and you say, wow, the Cardac, everybody it knows that now, but not at the time. It seemed like it took forever. And Right to Repair also helped as well, because we were having challenges with car companies who they had J2534 subscriptions, but you can only buy a year at a time. And a lot of people can't buy a year of a brand of car to fix one car. And maybe they don't see that brand every day. So Right to Repair was really helpful in getting daily, monthly, yearly subscriptions and starting to identify some of the issues and gaps of coverage and stuff.
It's really interesting you say that, because I remember when the Cardac came onto the scene, right? And like, I remember it started and people looked at it in the magazine and thought, I don't know about that. And then slowly but surely it gained popularity. Right. And it got more and more popular among technicians. And then all of a sudden it became, this is the go-to. This is what you need. You need to buy this. This is what you have to have. And so much of that, I think from my perspective, because I started in the performance world too, right? And so when you say SCT, I'm thinking like the X3 and the Livewire and all the stuff for the diesel trucks, right? And so for me, it's very interesting because we've talked on the show a number of times about the hype, right? And how the hype can make or break a brand. And like so much of what your brands do is dependent on what the consumer or what the user of the product is willing to say about it on the internet today. And so I watched kind of the Cardac rise to fame, if you will, as it started out, and it was just in the magazine, and then everybody was recommending it 6 months, a year later. So it was pretty neat to watch that from the outside looking in. When you talk about right to repair, because we're really involved with the Auto Care Association. We're really involved with ETI and Tool Tech and the whole thing. You're really involved with ETI. You're on the board, right? And so when you look at that, from your perspective as somebody who's producing these tools and gaining this access, as well as somebody who's on that board, somebody that's involved with SEMA, somebody that's involved with Auto Care Association, there's a lot of talk about right to repair, but there's a lot of technicians and a lot of shops that look at it and say, I don't know that really affects me. What are your thoughts on that from the outside looking in as far as shops go, as far as technicians go? Do you think it's going to affect them in the long run?
I always felt like it was important. And when right to repair first came around, and gosh, it was probably like 2009, 2010 when we first got involved, it was interesting that some industry associations were in support of it and some were not supporting it. And I could never understand why wouldn't you support right to repair? And I thought, well, maybe it's in the details. Like maybe I'm going to read this thing and it's going to not make sense. And I read it and I thought it's about access to diagnostics for everybody. And you could sort of universally apply right to repair to any industry and say, look, I just need access to my iPhone screen diagnostic tool or, whatever it is. And automotive, we were in an interesting place because we were starting to get to where you needed OE tools to do certain things. And there was a reprogramming mandate from the EPA. So we didn't need right to repair for reprogramming, but we needed it for diagnostics. And, it just, without it, you just potentially don't have access to things that you need. So we were a big advocate from the beginning. And there's always like, this is what it says and this is what it means. And the translation of the right to repair laws into practice is something that took another decade after it was, passed. And it was passed in Massachusetts, and I think the MOU was 2014. Well, it's 2024 now, right? So it's now been 10 years since right to repair started. It's not perfect. What does it mean for a technician? And I think one way to relate this to something really relevant is the collision industry. In the collision industry, I'm sure you're familiar with pre-scan and post-scan, where a car comes in after a collision and they scan it to see what codes it has. It helps them to understand how to write the estimate. And then when it's all done, they post-scan it to say that it's now fixed correctly. Well, the OEMs who originally weren't hugely in favor of right to repair, which you can't blame an OEM because they really don't like regulations. They'd rather take care of it on their own. And the OEMs have adapted to a lot of industry need without regulation, but sometimes it is required. So they weren't in favor of the regulation. But then when collision came around, something interesting happened. They issued positions to repairers that said, for this car to be safe, you must scan it using our software, an OE post-scan. But you couldn't actually have an OE post-scan without right to repair and access to OE diagnostic software to the whole world. And so that was kind of a great statement that the OEMs have actually kind of come around to elements of this. And now every car that's in a collision is supposed to be scanned with the OEM software. And the value to the shop is to make sure that the car is fixed correctly. For sure. Because they don't want to send a car home and have it come back and, the check engine light or the, lane departure warning comes on, 50 miles later. The customer's mad at them. They have to rework that job. There's lost profits. So the shop, benefits in that case by having that accessibility, and the consumer actually benefits too. Right to repair was sold as, hey, it's a competition and right of choice. But in this collision instance, it's actually your vehicle is sent home safely, instead of sent home without systems not working. And, in North America, not every dealership has a collision bay. In fact, most of the collision repairs are happening outside of dealerships. So right to repair was really a great example of why OE service information and OE tools need to be available to everybody.
I agree. And you know, one of the big things for me, or one of the things that made me really think about this or dig into the thought process here, is the majority, and until you become involved with ETI, you don't see that the majority of manufacturers really are working to make the independent repair space better, right? Because they recognize, hey, it's our logo on the front of that car. We're still responsible for it. And it affects the consumer buying patterns if they can't get their car fixed. The majority of the manufacturers are at the table saying, hey, let's work together to make this better for everybody. There's a few who are not. And so one of the things that I've always been worried about is the right to repair and an aggressive act of enforcement with right to repair. Does that negatively impact us with those manufacturers that are coming to the table willing to play ball? I mean, you look at Toyota, right? They're fantastic. And they're saying, hey, look, we're releasing a new diagnostic software. We want the independents to have a chance to look at it and give their input. We want the dealers to have their input. But then you look at some other brands, and I'm not going to say any names because I don't have to, but you look at some of these tools and it's like, holy crap, what am I supposed to do with $40,000 worth of tools for a car that I'm going to work on 3 times, right? And the subscription costs that are outlandish, man, they're just insane. And so I understand we have to have right to repair to make sure that there's more of an equal playing field, but are we at risk for damaging the relationships that we already have by pushing so hard to bring some in alignment? What do you think about that?
You know, Toyota's a great example of one of the OEMs who has always been on the side of the repair shop and the consumer. And I think it's really a part of their just company culture is, hey, we want our customers to have a good experience anywhere that they have their car serviced, so they are loyal customers.
For sure.
And, you know, and back in my DrewTech days, we started working with Toyota well before right to repair. In fact, Toyota released a version of their J2534 software on Mongoose in 2008. It was called TechStream Lite. That predated right to repair entirely.
Right.
And I think when right to repair came around, they looked at Toyota, and there were a few other OEMs doing that as well, and saying, that's a pretty good model, you know, and like anything where you have a regulation and it benefits everybody, which right to repair did, it's not necessary for everybody. It's necessary for those who maybe have some reason why they don't want to do it. And, you know, there's politics inside of every automaker, and many automakers in the 2000s suffered from this internal battle of, do we want the dealership to do the work, or do we want anybody to do the work? And I think a lot of car companies have moved past that, but some still seem to struggle with the idea that the only qualified place to have a car repaired is at the franchise dealership. And I think also that kind of stems from their desire to sell parts through those channels, where in the aftermarket parts are in competition with, you know, aftermarket parts and reman parts and things.
I don't know. I've got to say this because you bring it up. I am seeing a massive shift in OE parts, that they are substantially more competitive now, especially in a time when we're seeing, and I don't know that you hear this much of this, but aftermarket parts right now, it's bad. I mean, it is to the point that every single day you're hearing shops say, I can't use aftermarket parts. I have to go OES or I have to go OE, because aftermarket parts, there is a very, very clear quality problem right now. And if you don't shop your parts and know what you're buying, and so I think that the OE is becoming more competitive in this part space than they ever have before, and it feels like it's by design. And now, that being said, I've seen some quality issues in some of the OE parts even, but it's nothing like it is in the aftermarket world, right? I mean,
yeah. Probably a GM dealership who's offering them, but it's pretty good pricing. And, you know, like I just bought a starter for a 2018 Cadillac XT5, and the AC Delco price was $136, and the aftermarket price was $140. And it's kind of a no-brainer, right? If you're going to go OE new versus aftermarket reman. Becomes a bit more challenging. The OE parts requirements are only for so many years that they have to carry in stock, and then Sometimes OE parts that are more than 10 or 15-year-old model year cars are actually reman parts that are rebranded back as OE.
Yeah.
And so you would see, and I won't say any particular brands, but you would see a certain OE brand of part back off, especially when it's a programmable part.
For sure.
Because the programmable part space is really changing, in the last 5 years and the next 5 years, everything is coded now. And, aftermarket parts are pretty tough to get for, coded parts, headlights and things like that.
Well, right to repair, when we think about the part aspect of it, right? 15 years ago, it didn't seem like that big of a deal. Right. But now when you're talking about a center stack in an automobile, that's a $7,000 part and we need to at least be able to access it before we make a call on it instead of sending it back to the dealer. And I'm not speaking poorly of dealer techs, but the pay systems within the dealer environment and some of the cultures in some dealerships, this is not a manufacturer issue. This is a dealership management issue. The pay structures and the cultures within those organizations lead to part swapping. And a lot of it is, hey, I have this part sitting here. I'm going to plug it in and see if it works, or just sell it to them. And if that doesn't work, we'll try something else, because they're not really fairly paid for doing the testing that it would take to find that. And so we're seeing a lot of those automobiles in our shops. And when you're talking about such a large investment, not having the access to the data, not having the access to the tool to be able to communicate with that component clearly and in a proper way. And one of the things I found really interesting in some of the discussions with the OEs is there was almost this air about them that they thought that repair shops were trying to hack stuff together. And I'm sure there are some that are trying to do that. But it was a wake-up call to them in these conversations that there are shops out here who are trying to do this by the book, who are trying to test this properly, who have more trained technicians than what the dealership does, who have more capabilities, right? And I think that when we move into this space where we have such advanced technology, we can be an asset to the manufacturer. I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing for the manufacturers. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that having access to the best diagnostic tool and service information is really important to fix the car right. And I've heard the sentiment that you said where OEMs might think the shops are sort of trying to hack things together. And I don't really see that very much. You see shops that are trying to diagnose and avoid part swapping. And there's a lot of great non-OE tools out in the market. But there's always a point where having the OE tool becomes critical. And I'll give an example. So at my house, we always have a project car or two. And my son bought this Cadillac XT5 that we ordered a starter for. It was actually struck by lightning. He bought it as a project car.
Oh my!
Can you imagine? It's a 2018 car diagnosing a lightning strike vehicle without the OE schematics, without the OE tool. When the lightning hit this vehicle, it actually caused the immobilizer to go out of sync between the BCM and ECM. So we needed to have TechLine Connect and GDS to be able to do the programming and the coding of all these parts. And, you can't swap every electronic module on a car. So you have to have the GM bus tool and see what's coming online. And at the same time, I also use the Opus tool on the same car because it's a multi-tiered approach to how you diagnose. But I think the days of part swapping, they really will come to an end soon because you can't economically justify part swapping coded parts anymore.
For sure.
And if everything is coded and programmed, now you're going to put in a much more expensive part. You're going to program it, and then you're going to realize that it didn't solve the problem. I just don't see how that can go on forever.
Yeah. The consumer won't tolerate it. Plain and simple. And in some ways, the consumer won't tolerate it right now. The consumer won't tolerate what's happening in many of these repair shops. Now, I'm going to upset some people, straight up piss some people off here, but they've used sales techniques and they've used a slick talking advisor on the front counter to cover it up, right? And they've told the client the thing that sounded good and what they wanted to hear. But all of a sudden, when you throw a $6,000 part at a car, because their HVAC doesn't work and nothing else works. And you say, oh, I bet it's this. And you buy that $6,000 part and you put it in there and you say, oh, well, it turns out we need to do some additional testing and it's also this over here. That was still bad, though. I don't know that you're going to get a consumer to buy into that for very long. I mean, David's pretty slick talking, maybe. I don't know.
Well, that's a tough job for the mechanical industry. You know, the collision industry serves the vehicle owner, but it's paid by an insurance company. And so the path for how you repair a collision vehicle is really your blueprinting towards what needs to happen. In a mechanical environment, you have so many challenges. First, you have to sell the consumer on fixing their car because they may not want to fix it. They may want to just drive it broken and take it, you know, out the door. If there's not a state inspection requirement to fix it, first they have to be willing to fix it. And then you have to come up with a number on what it's going to be to fix it. And then that's based on your assumption that it's this part, I need this diagnostic software, it's a subscription. You've built this plan that can change. You know, and especially if you're part swapping and you haven't really reached a full diagnostic, you know, procedure, then you got to call them back and say, hey, I know that I said it was going to be an alternator, but it's actually an ECM or something else. And man, that's a tough job. Yeah, I can't imagine having to make that phone call. And you would think that that probably builds, you know, more just willingness to go down the right path. But we see it a lot. And, you know, I don't want to paint any technicians in a bad light because there's a lot of technicians who are learning. And there's also a lot of brands of vehicles they have to deal with. So they don't have an easy job to begin with.
Right.
It's even harder when you involve the consumer and they say, yeah, I don't want it. Never mind. You know, you've gone down this path. And yeah, it's a tough job. For sure.
Well, and I think that we've set ourselves up for failure in a lot of ways, because what we might come up with on one of these complex automobiles is that, hey, my shop pays 1 hour for a diag, or they pay 0.5 for diag, and it doesn't matter what it is. So they throw me into a comms fault, and I find that it's a broken wire, and it took me 3 hours to find this broken wire in, you know, a harness with 250 wires in it. And now they expect they're going to write an estimate for $50 to fix this wire. And so where do I get mine back? Right. And they expect the car to be fixed. So what do? They start just throwing things at it. And I think it's caused them to be very creative in a lot of ways. And so a lot of this, in my opinion, goes back to the systems and constructs we've built within the industry that tolerate that behavior. And it starts with pay systems, right? Because I don't want to say it's all about money to people, but in the same respect, if you ask somebody to do something enough times and you tell them, hey, I'm not going to pay you for that, sooner or later, they're going to find a way around it. Sooner or later, they're going to say, because value has to go both ways. It can't just be I'm providing value to the client. You have to provide value to your staff too. And if they're unwilling to do that.
Rate? Yeah, I'm curious, like as you're talking, like how do you feel about flat rate pay?
Yeah. Oh man, look, it needs to burn, and you know where. I upset a lot of people, and I'm going to tell you something, because when we moved into 10 bays, right, we were in 3 bays, and the thought of flat rate never crossed my mind. But the effort it takes to manage 10 bays and to keep 5 or 6 technicians moving at all times, the amount of work it takes, the amount of financial skill it takes to manage the money and the stress and everything that comes along with it, I get it. It makes sense to me why they paid flat rate, because it's easier to manage. It's easier to handle that. But then you have to build the system on the other side. Okay, well, we have to charge for testing. How much time does he need for testing? And so now you've got an advisor who's paid commission who doesn't want to have a low CSI score from calling back to ask for an extra hour or extra 0.5 or whatever it is. And so the systems are built up against one another. And you find yourself in a situation where nobody's willing to make the call. And that's why I do the hourly hybrid pay plan, because I feel like I want them to have some type of reward. Now, look, I'm going to say something that's super unpopular. You can have people that are too comfortable. And I have clearly found myself in that situation more than once, where I pay them enough that all of a sudden they're not producing, because you know what? That's stressful and that's hard, and I make just as much money whether I do or whether I don't, so I can survive on what I get. I don't really have to try that hard. And I have found myself in that situation before. I'm not going to say I'm there now, but I have definitely found myself there before. So I get why people use flat rate for sure. Yeah, David, what about you?
It's tough.
No, I don't use flat rate. It's terrible. I don't use a bonus and garbage either. That's just flat rate. Is that
why your shop bills 10 hours a week?
25. That's all we have to do. You have to get it. Yeah, hey, you have to figure out what's profitable. That doesn't make it like you figure out what's profitable and then get to that number. However you have to, just get to that number. The rest is whatever. Then the rest is just like chasing after boats. I just need a boat. It's like now you have a boat. I want a second house. Now I have a second house. I want a bigger boat. Like when does this stop? You just keep chasing more and more. What's the point? How has consolidation affected you, Brian? The company is moving into Opus been beneficial to DrewTech overall? How do you see consolidation overall in the industry? Because that seems to be this last year a huge big trend.
Yep.
Huge, big vendors and smaller vendors just consolidating into now this giant conglomerate that owns 17 different brands. You know, from a consumer standpoint, I'm a customer of 2 or 3 of these brands. Now they're under one company. Everybody tells you it's a great thing. They're like, oh, that's going to be wonderful. We're going to have more resources. I don't know. That still has to be seen whether that's going to play out to benefit the consumer or not. I don't know. I don't know that. I think I was aware of DrewTech after you guys became part of Opus, where maybe it was too small before or too niche, or there just wasn't enough marketing dollars behind it for me, the average like shop owner, to be aware of it. But I can see the benefits. But how has it affected you guys?
It's been a fun journey. DrewTech, when I joined there, it was really small, and when we were acquired by Opus, we were still relatively small. I think we were less than 40 people at that point. What DrewTech did before the Opus acquisition versus after, we pretty much did the same things, but we did more of them. We still made Cardac and Mongoose and new J2534 devices, but under the new Opus, umbrella, we had the ability to grow. And the first thing we did when we were part of Opus is we said, look, we'd really like to help people do reprogramming. But we make these tools and we go to these events and we do training, and it's just not catching on fast enough. There's a lot of people who just don't want to download the subscriptions and, follow right to repair and do it themselves. So the first product we did together under Opus was called RAP, which was remote programming. And it was tough. It took us 4 years to really get that off the ground. It took a lot of money and a lot of people and a lot of mistakes, frankly, is whenever you launch something new, you try things and they don't work, and you try other things and they don't work. And I can safely say we never would have done that as DrewTech because we just didn't have the resources to take that big of a risk and go launch RAP. And, today there's more than 10,000 users of RAP and at transmission shops and everybody. And I feel like it solved a problem in the market. Also under Opus, we had the desire to put together a remote services team and a better diagnostic tool. Drew was always OE, and we said, look, we'd like to have some multi-branded, tool in a part of it. And I spent 10 years trying to convince all these different diagnostic companies to build a J2534 version of their software so it could just run through Cardac. Well, nobody ever took me up on it. So when Opus came together, I had the opportunity to go acquire a couple diagnostic companies, AutoLogic and AutoIngenuity, and they were great products. But the first requirement under the acquisition is to make your software J2534. So now we can have an aftermarket diagnostic tool running through the same VCI that the OE software does. So we were able to accomplish a lot. And, I would never look back and say, as an owner of Drew and one of the early entries, I regretted the Opus acquisition, because I think from an industry perspective and what we were able to advance, it scaled way better than we ever could have. It's not like we wouldn't have gotten to some of these places, but we never would have acquired a diagnostic company. We probably would have launched RAP and probably never reached the level that we're at now. But to be fair, we've had great ownership, and they've allowed us to lose money and take risks and do things that are not your typical consolidation. A lot of consolidators of companies say, look, I'm going to put these two things together and I'm going to maximize the profits. That was not our mission. We wanted to put these things together and build something that was different. And, obviously the upside is high if we can get there, but the risk is high. And so it was really great. And it's, we're still in it, and we're still growing. So that's been my journey, and, a lot of adventures along the way of mistakes made and, cool things that have worked out. When I look at the industry and I see a lot of the consolidation that's happening, in collision, I see benefits to individual shop owners who've owned the shop for 20, 30 years, and, they're looking for an exit, and this is not a bad opportunity for them to take it. For technicians who want to have a career path of growing up into a larger brand, a larger opportunity, and also kind of increased leverage to talk with insurers and OEMs about parts pricing or reimbursement. Yeah. So there's definitely benefits from it. There's also downsides too. If you're trying to be an individual store operator and that's your goal, and now you've got all these giants around you, and you don't always benefit from them if you don't go with the flow. And the mechanical side, there's not as much consolidation right now of shops, because I think you go back to that customer conversation, which is very difficult to have when you want to sell things. It's slowed down consolidation in the mechanical industry of shops. But mechanical suppliers, they're consolidating. Does it benefit all of us to have less parts suppliers? I'm not sure, right? I think that you get too few parts suppliers and too few competition, and that could be a hindrance to the industry. That could slow down innovation. So I think it cuts both ways. I don't want to say I'm overly optimistic or pessimistic about it. I think when it's done right, it can be amazing. And when it's just done for consolidating profits and cutting costs, I'm not sure we really get value as an industry from that kind of activity.
For sure.
I can tell you absolutely without a doubt, the reason why there isn't a lot of consolidation in the mechanical side is because there are so many terrible operators. They are making money because they are in a cheap situation. They have cheap labor, cheap overhead, and they are barely making any money. And somebody that wants to buy that particular space, the real estate has to be absolutely killer for them to want to invest in that, because the operation itself is worthless. It's absolutely, completely, 100% worthless. And the operator doesn't realize it. The owner doesn't realize. They think, hey, I've been here for 25 years and I've been able to make this quote unquote successful. The problem is you're doing $600,000 a year. You've got maybe 2 employees. You do most of the work.
It's barely above the water. You're tread water.
And you're making maybe, I don't know, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 a year. And the only reason why you're making that any kind of money is because you paid the building off 5 or 10 years ago. And it was only because you bought it when the building was worth $100,000. But now that real estate might be worth $1 million, maybe. And that's the only reason why anybody wants to come talk to you. But if the space isn't worth $1 million, potentially $1 million, nobody wants to do anything with you. And there's no reason why anybody would want to come buy you up. Where collision, I think collision was so tight with the insurance companies dictating the process. They didn't have a choice. Like, we have to do it this way, otherwise we're not going to make any money, because the people paying the bill have dictated the way I have to do it. You don't see that in the mechanical side.
Well, and the mechanical side, what we're seeing, it's the same thing as my friend Derek, right? And David, you remember the story I told about the shop where the guy said, I want $1 million for it, and the building's just not like, hey, all you have is the property, right? That's all you have that has any value to it. Well, my friend buys it, right? And so really great guy, fantastic technician. And that's what keeps happening is a technician sees an opportunity. Oh, I want to work for myself. I want to buy a shop. And they go out and they buy this shop. Well, it turns out he was charging $45 an hour and he wasn't marking parts up. So now he comes in and he tries to start running it like an actual business, and all the clients leave. And so it's like starting a business from scratch all over again. And that's what's happening to a lot of these mechanical shops. And so I don't think that there's a space, and we're seeing more consolidation than we had been, but there's not a big consolidator coming in and scooping them up. I mean, collisions being scooped up left and right. I mean, it's not even slowed down a touch, and they're just shop after shop after shop.
They're dumping the mechanical side.
Yeah.
We have a lot of operators around here that they were collision plus mechanical. They dumped the mechanical side entirely. Oh, we don't work, and they won't honor any of the repairs. That's great. Customer had a repair done a year ago. They've been bought out, and they just say, "Hey, sorry, you're screwed."
We don't do that now.
Yeah, we don't do that anymore. What do you do? Wrap was interesting. I bought my first J box like 2017. And it's because I wanted to keep everything in house. And I remember talking to my tool guy, and he said, nobody is buying this thing. Nobody is buying this thing. And I couldn't understand why. I'm like, hey, I'm installing parts that require programming. I don't want to send it off to the dealer because either I have to tow it, and then I have to coordinate, and then who knows when they're even going to touch it, and they're always behind, and then it delays the repair for several days. Why wouldn't I want to do this in-house? And I've got this great tool, and it does 90% of what I need it to do. Like, this is fantastic. Wrap comes around, and it took a little bit of time to take off, but I cannot believe how many shops were refusing to accept the need for programming. It was wild. And Wrap seems to have masked the actual underlying problem, which is just overall ignorance from the shop owner side, not understanding that they need this. Hey, you need this in your shop. Yeah. You don't realize it, but you do. And I don't know how many repairs you're not able to do, or ignoring, or not being able to diagnose because you can't do X, Y, Z. And it's because you don't have this thing. How were you guys able to finally like cross over or cross that threshold that said, well, now we're actually making Wrap viable? And do you think maybe those efforts should have gone into just selling the device to begin with?
I think one of my lessons is anything that's going to be sustainable takes a decade. Cardac took a decade. Wrap is not quite a decade. We've got another year and a half to go. When we launched it, we actually launched it with AC Delco. And it was an OEM supported effort. We were selling it through GM wholesale, and it was specifically targeted towards the Tecum module in the 6L80 trans, because the Tecum modules were failing, and they could sell a new Tecum module, but it had to be programmed. And so the whole trans industry was the first target. And like anything, it just took years to educate on the need. I'm not a fan of buying reman electronics that are pre-programmed because they got the wrong VIN in them. Yeah. There's adaptive things that have to be reset. It's just not the right way to fix a car, in my opinion. So we went down this journey with GM and wholesale, and so we launched it, and it was really for GM transmissions, plus we had Ford and Chrysler. But to really catch on wholesale, we needed like everything, because your typical shop owner is promised all these things. Again, you have to be a skeptic if you're in a repair shop and a tool guy walks in, or you read a magazine that says does everything perfectly. Everybody says it, and it's never really the case, right? Nothing is perfect. And so our challenge was first to get this product out and to get it supporting things, but then we had to educate on this is what we can do and this is what we can't do. And that education doesn't really help you sell tools, because they're like, oh, wait, you're telling me you can't do something? What else can't you do? And then over time, we build up the coverage. Now we can do pretty much anything you could do with a J-Box. But it's just taken us 8-9 years to do. So now we're getting momentum. And then, a shop sees another shop using it. I think there's a lot of trust amongst peers at, mechanical shops. Call my friend and find out what they're using versus, buying off of a magazine ad or at a trade show. And I don't blame them because of all of the promises that are out there, but it just takes an incredibly long time, even if you have a good idea and it's well implemented, for it to really get off the ground.
I think one of the interesting things that's come of that here recently, and I'd love to get your take on it, is the situation with the Nissan transmissions And there's been a lot of talk as far as wrap goes, as far as installation in shop and how to handle that, and being able to obtain a warranty, because a lot of shops have been installing these Nissan transmissions. We even talked to somebody maybe 2 weeks ago that installed one, towed it to the dealer to have it programmed, and Nissan denied the warranty and said, no, it wasn't programmed correctly. And so I see that there's a new TSB that's out. Do you have any insight on that for them that are programming these transmissions? How do you make sure that there's that proper level of documentation to ensure they're covered when it comes to something like that?
We work with these every single day. And, we work with, sometimes programming doesn't work, right? I mean, if 99% of reprogramming is successful and 1% fails, that means every single day in our call center, we've got a handful of failed events, and we deal with those through recovery. Sometimes we work with dealerships. We guarantee our programming, so we've always stood behind it. And we've had engagement with dealers and with Nissan. We use Nissan software under license, and we create documentation for every single programming event we do. So there's never been a question. Once it reaches the high enough level of communication, like, look, let us show you we're using your software. Yeah. Here's what was done. The CARDAC is a validated Nissan VCI. In fact, DrewTech made OE tools for Nissan in Japan. I was part of that project in 2012. We were working with Japan. So we have deep relationships, but it doesn't stop somebody at a dealership or at a regional level saying, hey, I'm not going to pay for this. Yeah. And we just get the right people involved. We educate, and it's like anything else. Once you run it to ground, it's not an issue, but it just took some time to get there.
And I think that's one of the key benefits of having an organization like that behind it, is that it knows who to call, right? Because I've gained connections over the years to where I can call somebody and ask for help for something. But the reality is a lot of shops don't have that opportunity. They don't have that person to call to fix a problem like that. And so they might just be out that money. They might be buying that client a new transmission. And so it stands to reason that it's a valuable resource to have on your side, that if you're going to program that transmission, at least you have somebody who does this every day. And now you have a record that, hey, it was done properly, and here's the record, here's what it looks like. And it's like that technical service bulletin. It lays out exactly what has to be done to program that transmission and to be able to obtain warranty. Well, at least if you're using somebody that knows that bulletin exists and they're following the procedure, you don't have to worry about it. Whereas if you're trying to do it yourself and you misclick something, you don't do it every day. You might install one Nissan transmission a month, and I'm giving them a lot of credit on the quality of that transmission. But if you don't, think of what that does to you, and that's a $4,000, $5,000 unit right there, and that money's gone. So I think that programming pays for itself in that sense. To shift gears a little bit, there was a whole big deal about another technology by service or a programming service getting in bed with Geico a while back. And
I've heard about that one.
Yeah, it really upset a lot of people. Now, we're not in the collision industry. Can you give us a rundown why people are so mad? Because David and I have talked about it. And we're like, we don't exactly know what the deal is. Can you give us a rundown why everybody's so upset about that?
Yeah, I've read the news and I've seen some of the posts about it, and my opinion, from the Opus view, is that we do have a responsibility to educate insurers on why cars need to be repaired. And that's always been a part of Opus's, mission, is to talk to insurance companies and explain, you need to scan this car. It needs to be OE. You need to calibrate this car. And so we've always been on this mission to communicate that information with insurance companies. And I've had people tell me, watch out for insurers. And I've said, look, we're not in this to set a price or put you in a position where we're in the middle of you two, but we can actually create value for both sides by educating. And we've always been kind of a technical expert in the space. If you go back to Right to Repair, we've testified in front of Congress and NHTSA and DOT, like, this is why this has to happen. It's extremely important to repair the car right. So that's the Opus hat. Now, if I look at other actions that have happened in the industry, and, I don't want to really condemn anybody or anything they've done, but I could say that I see a lot of friction when any company works with another company, and then there's a repair shop or a collision shop at the end who gets the output of that, and it controls their profitability or, the decisions that they have to make to make money. So I could understand why there was some friction there. We certainly weren't interested in being a part of a program that sets a price. It's one thing if an insurance company or repair shop comes to some agreement and then they bring us in as a third party to help them implement it. We do that all day long, but that's where we are in this. And, I think everybody saw that, and, probably things will change in the future within our industry based on how that was reacted to, and the lessons learned there would be my thought.
For sure. And I agree with you. And I think that was the main concern, was that, hey, you didn't bring us to the table to discuss this. You didn't have an agreement with us first. You came in and said, this is what's happening and this is what you get paid. And to them, that kind of felt a little shady there. That felt like, hold up now, you're setting my price for me. And I think that's one of the things that is I got to know more people in collision, right? Because I was on the AASP national board, and I started seeing more and more of that. And that's one of the reasons that I'm kind of against things like Repair Pal is, hey, don't let somebody else come in and tell you what your price is. You have to be very careful about that and giving them that bandwidth to set that. And especially in the consumer's eyes, because it's one thing when it's an insurance company. It's another thing when the consumer's being told what it should be. But it was, man, it upset a lot of people. I probably saw 500 or 600 videos about it in like the first 2 weeks that all that happened.
I mean, everybody in this space has challenges to deal with, right? Yeah. Collision repair shops need to fix the car correctly. Mm-hmm. They need to make sure they get reimbursed for it. They have a customer to make happy. Insurance companies are trying to reduce fraud and make sure they're paying for what they're getting. And to some extent, the insurance companies will point out, well, look at this car I was charged a calibration on, and it's a 1980 car. So clearly there's no calibrating. And I'm sure there's multiple sides to this. And, at the end of the day, repair shops and insurers should work out the details of their business arrangement. Opus is a diagnostic partner. We'll support both of them in the decisions they make. And Opus has a lot of MSO customers. We've been really focused on helping MSOs grow their business and scale. And so we look to them and say, how can we help you? And can we help educate? Can we help bring awareness? One of the opportunities we see is to help all parties understand what calibrations need to be done. Yeah. And that's really one of our missions in collision, is to bring awareness to what calibrations need to be done. And everybody benefits from that. The consumer benefits, the repair shop benefits, the insurer benefits. I mean, there's rarely do you have a situation where when you do something, like everybody in the value stream gets benefit. And that's where you should focus your business, right? Is you don't take from one and give to the other. So identifying the calibrations is where we're at. And we try to stay out of all of the other stuff.
The political side of it, right?
And that's why, go back to me, like you say, I'm not really around very much. Like, we're heads down, just trying to get things done for our customers. And, when all these things erupt online, we just go back to work.
Yeah. Amen, buddy. Amen. Hey, last question for you. And we'll touch on this very carefully. We are huge proponents of ETI, right? And I see what they're doing for the industry. And there was a lot of pushback over stuff that happened with other organizations and this and that. And there were all these videos made talking about ETI. And, from my standpoint, I can look back and I can laugh about it because I know it's not true, right? Like, it's not even remotely true what some of the things were said. What, in your eyes, what is it that ETI does for the independent repair shops, be it collision or be it mechanical? Because I see it my way. I want to hear what your take on it is.
ETI is really about connecting OEMs with those who make tools for repair shops. And there's been repair shops that have visited ETI events, and I get it, like there's a lot of good trends and information, but it's really the companies who make diagnostic tools. We need an advocate with OEMs. Sometimes OEMs want to charge a crazy amount of money for data that we need to build the diagnostic tool. And if we're one-on-one with those OEMs, we really don't have much of a choice but to say either we play ball or we don't play ball. And either way, it doesn't really benefit the repairer, because if we have to pay a ton of money for licensing, it just gets passed through in the end somehow. And if we don't play ball, it's just one less option they have to be able to perform the service. So ETIs really fits as a single industry entity in that space. Nobody else advocates for the tool companies with the OEMs. It's not like a glamorous institute, and it doesn't really interact with the repair shops and the technicians, except that, you know, they're the ultimate consumer of products that ETI helped enable.
Absolutely.
And, you know, ETI is primarily in North America right now. They did announce at Tool Tech they're expanding to Europe. I'm excited for that because I think the European OEMs are at times they feel far away from us, even though Opus has an office in the UK and we have business in Europe. We just have a much better business model and stronger relationships with OEMs who participate in North America. And we hope to change that. We hope as secure gateway is starting to become more prevalent, that we'll be able to protect for access through ETI and those relationships. So technicians have a choice. Because look, if your only choice is an OE tool at the end of the day, that means you have access, but what are you going to pay for it?
Yeah.
You know, if you
Absolutely.
don't have any kind of competition for the ability to clear a code on a vehicle with the secure gateway, then you're going to pay what you're going to pay. And it might be $64 for 3 days of access to clear a code. It just might be, right?
Well, you know, here's what I see. Is there was a lot of stuff saying, oh, ETI is trying to restrict things. ETI is trying to, you know, charge for this and charge. Like, no, they are literally the reason you have the access you have right now, right? And they continue to nurture and grow these relationships through the networking and the connections that are available there to the tool companies to ensure that the repair shop, be it mechanical or collision, can continue to fix the car. And that's the extent of it. And so I've seen the work that goes in. I've seen the people who are there to provide information, and I've seen their perspectives. And anywhere that you can get the OEs and a tool company in the same room, and they say, hey, we see this problem, let's work together to fix it, it means that my life gets better. My life gets easier. And so I was so bummed to see all those people talking poorly about it, because I see the work that ETI does. And it partially made me mad, and I wanted to kind of rage out a little bit, because my thing is I knew it was BS, right? When you see what they do and when you get a chance to experience it and hear what they say, you know those things were not true. You could see what it was that they were accomplishing. And so I'm excited to see what they accomplish with the new expansion into the UK and where it goes. But I think it's only good things that come from that organization. I really do. I'm not just saying that. I mean, from the bottom of my heart, I know that they're doing the right thing for this industry. And I'll go out on a limb and say, yeah, I know that it's not a direct integration with repair shops, but I do not think our industry would be capable of what it is today if it wasn't for the work that ETI has been putting in over the past 50 years.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Awesome.